The Spanish Empire was born at the end of the 15th century after the union of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon and the fall of the last Muslim stronghold in Granada. With the discovery of America in 1492, Spain began an unprecedented expansion that led it to establish dominions in Europe, America, Africa, and Asia. In a few decades, the country transformed into the first global power, controlling vast maritime routes connecting continents and maintaining its power through exploration, conquest, and transoceanic trade. During the 16th and 17th centuries, under the reigns of Charles I and Philip II, the empire reached its maximum extent and consolidated its political, military, and economic influence. The wealth extracted from America drove European development, but also generated conflicts, inflation, and prolonged wars. Men such as Hernán Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, Juan Sebastián Elcano, and Blas de Lezo embodied the different stages of that expansion. With them, chapters that changed the history of the world were written: the conquest of indigenous empires, the first circumnavigation of the planet, and the defense of strategic territories against rival powers. For more than 3 centuries, the Spanish Empire was a central force in global politics and left a cultural, linguistic, and religious legacy that still defines much of the Hispanic world. The birth of a composite monarchy, Isabel, Fernando, and shared power. During much of the Middle Ages, the different kingdoms that occupied the Iberian Peninsula followed separate paths. Castile and Aragon, the most influential among them, built their own political and territorial trajectories which did not respond to a common design or shared interest. In Castile, power was consolidated under a monarchy that exercised strong control over the extensive territory, while Aragon, with a more complex structure, was composed of different domains with distinct laws and systems united under a single royal figure. The parallel evolution of both kingdoms maintained a fragmentation for centuries that made any lasting unification process unlikely. Throughout the 15th century, Castile and Aragon underwent profound transformations. Castile experienced successive confrontations over the throne, marked by divisions among great noble lineages, while Aragon, despite its Mediterranean expansion, did not achieve internal cohesion, with courts maintaining strong autonomy. In this scenario of political fragmentation, a key alliance was formed. The marriage between Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, celebrated in 1469. Both sought to strengthen their internal positions and project their joint authority. Far from being a romantic gesture, it was a calculated strategy within the Iberian political chessboard. However, the marriage formula did not imply the unification of the territories under a single state structure. Isabella retained exclusive control over Castilian affairs, while Ferdinand continued managing the Aragonese domains independently. Each kingdom maintained its legal system, currency, administrative institutions, and legislative bodies. The duality extended even to military decisions and the organization of the treasury. The Catholic monarchs acted in a coordinated manner but did not merge their governments. The Hispanic monarchy was thus born as an alliance of crowns that respected their mutual autonomy. In the religious sphere, the dynastic alliance also had strategic implications. Both monarchs shared a vision of Catholic unity as a basis for reinforcing royal authority. In Castile, control of the church provided a tool of centralization, while in Aragon an attempt was made to maintain a balance between the local clergy and the demands of papal authority. The Catholic monarchs obtained from the Pope the right to appoint bishops, which strengthened their influence over ecclesiastical structures and facilitated greater ideological control over their subjects. Religion thus functioned as one of the axes of cohesion between kingdoms that remained legally distinct. As the 1470s progressed, Isabella managed to establish herself as Queen of Castile after defeating the supporters of Juana la Beltraneja in the Succession War. Ferdinand, meanwhile, assumed government duties in Castile when necessary. Although his authority was not automatically recognized, the royal couple worked together, but each acted based on their own rights. This hybrid formula, without equivalent precedents in Western Europe, consolidated a political model in which collaboration did not eliminate internal diversity. The construction of a new monarchy also required an effort to control the Castilian nobility, which for years had acted autonomously and accumulated power in their territories. Isabella promoted a policy of restoring royal authority, which included reclaiming lands ceded to the aristocracy and restructuring government bodies. The creation of the Royal Council as a central administrative instrument, along with the reorganization of justice and tax collection, allowed the crown to regain part of the power it had ceded. In Aragon, the mechanisms were different, but the goal of strengthening the king's position was also evident. The figure of the corregidores, established as direct representatives of royal power in Castilian cities, was a key step in creating a functional administrative apparatus. These delegates controlled the decisions of the urban councils and limited the influence of local oligarchies. Through them, the monarchy extended its reach to areas previously dominated by manorial or corporate interests. The Church, for its part, collaborated in this task, both through preaching and education. The personal union between Isabella and Ferdinand thus offered a flexible formula to coordinate kingdoms that were not legally merged but shared a common direction in foreign affairs, defense, and religious policy. From 1479, when Ferdinand was officially recognized as King of Aragon following his father's death, the couple became a symbol of joint power. On their coins, documents, and coats of arms, reference was made to the double crown. The expression Catholic Monarchs, granted by Pope Alexander VI, served as an institutional mark of a project that did not break with medieval tradition but announced a new style of governance. The balance between the two crowns was unstable and required constant adjustments. In Aragon, the Cortés and Fueros still carried considerable weight, and any attempt at centralization encountered resistance. In Castile, by contrast, the process of asserting royal power progressed more rapidly. This asymmetry would shape peninsular politics for the following decades. There was no single capital, no common tax system, no shared official language, but there was a shared project of expansion, consolidation, and strengthening of central power. The dynastic model resulting from the marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand was not a laboratory product or a theoretical construction. It was the result of pacts, compromises, and negotiations with local elites. Its success lay in its ability to combine authority and flexibility, to impose decisions without breaking internal balances. From this foundation, the monarchs undertook military campaigns, internal reforms, and foreign alliance policies that would shape the history of Europe and America in the centuries to come. The legacy of that union was not a unified Spain, but a structure of cooperating crowns. Instead of a modern state, a composite monarchy emerged that acted as if it were a unit without being legally so. It was this system that later allowed sustaining an empire with a presence on 4 continents, although its birth had been based on the simple decision of 2 young heirs to combine forces against their internal enemies. Granada, 1492, the fall that closed 7 centuries of history. The Kingdom of Granada, since the mid-13th century, had remained an independent political entity under the authority of the Nasrids. Although they formally accepted the supremacy of the Castilian monarchs, the emirate operated with full autonomy and had survived through a combination of diplomacy, tribute, and alliances. That fragile stability was maintained for generations while the rest of the peninsula moved toward Christian unification. Throughout the 15th century, tensions between Granada and Castile intensified. During that period, internal disputes within the Nasrid kingdom became constant, with confrontations between different claimants to the throne. These internal divisions weakened the emirate, while the Catholic monarchs consolidated their power and extended their control over Castilian and Aragonese territories. It was in 1482 when the final offensive began. The war started with the capture of Alhama, a fortified town on the border, taken by the Castilians after a surprise attack. That event marked the point of no return in the conflict. From then on, the military campaign advanced with a meticulous strategy, directed by the Crown and supported by a powerful logistical structure that included material resources, reinforcements, and ecclesiastical support. The clashes were constant throughout the following decade. The capture of key cities such as Ronda, Loja, and Malaga demonstrated the progress of the Christian troops, who gradually surrounded the core of Granada. Muslim resistance, although strong in some sectors, failed to stop the advance. Internal divisions among the supporters of Sultan Boabdil, his uncle El Zagal, and other leaders further weakened the emirate's defensive capacity. The city of Malaga, with its strategic port, fell in 1487 after a siege involving a massive deployment of resources and troops. This event was a decisive blow, as Granada lost its most important maritime connection. Subsequently, Baza and Guadix surrendered, key cities for the defense of the interior. The pressure became unbearable for the Nasrids, who saw their territory shrinking rapidly. During the last months of 1491, Castilian forces established a complete siege around Granada. Negotiations between Boabdil and the representatives of the Catholic monarchs intensified, as the Muslim leader knew he could not resist indefinitely. In December of that year, the capitulations regulating the terms of the surrender were signed. Among their conditions were religious and property guarantees for the Muslim inhabitants. On January 2, 1492, the city was officially handed over. Boabdil left the Alcázar and handed the keys of Granada to the envoys of the monarchs. Christian banners were raised atop the Alhambra, thus marking the end of Islamic rule on the Iberian Peninsula. The scene, witnessed by the royal courts and their armies, symbolized not only a military victory, but also the culmination of centuries of conflict. With the fall of Granada, a process that had begun more than 7 centuries earlier was completed. The reconquest of the territory by the Christian kingdoms ended with an act loaded with political and religious significance. The peninsula came entirely under the control of Christian monarchies, and Islam was excluded from the political map. The agreement signed between the Catholic monarchs and Boabdil included clauses guaranteeing respect for the religion, properties, and customs of the Muslims who decided to stay. However, over the years, these promises weakened. In 1499, the first pressures to force conversions began, which generated rebellions such as that of the Alpujarras. These tensions led to an increasingly restrictive policy, culminating in the expulsion of the Moriscos sometime later. The Granada campaign, unlike previous wars, was directed directly by the monarchs. Isabel and Fernando actively participated in the planning and execution of operations. They moved to the front, supervised the advance of the armies, and were involved in logistical decisions. This direct involvement strengthened the image of a centralized and determined monarchy capable of mobilizing resources and controlling the territory. The conflict also served as a stage to test new forms of military organization. The systematic use of artillery, mobile fortifications, and coordination between troops from different regions marked an evolution compared to previous wars. The Catholic monarchs consolidated a model of an army that combined noble forces, urban militias, and professional soldiers. The support of the Church was constant throughout the campaign. The official discourse presented the war as a crusade for the faith, which allowed for obtaining indulgences, raising funds, and mobilizing wills. Many prelates accompanied the army, and not a few offered their own resources to finance the war effort. The conquest was celebrated as a victory of the Christian faith over Islam. The victory in Granada also had internal consequences. It allowed the Catholic monarchs to reinforce their legitimacy, project an image of national unity, and consolidate their dynastic alliance. The union of the crowns of Castile and Aragon was supported by a common enterprise, presented as a shared achievement. The fall of Granada became a symbol of this new monarchy that sought to centralize power and project itself beyond its borders. Legally, the incorporation of Granada implied legal and administrative adjustments. Initially, some local structures were respected, but Castilian norms were imposed regulating property, taxation, and justice. Specific institutions were created to supervise the integration of the territory and resolve conflicts arising from coexistence between Christians and Muslims. In the social sphere, the incorporation of the Muslim population posed complex challenges. Although guarantees were offered in the capitulations, coexistence was not easy. Religious, cultural, and linguistic differences generated frictions that worsened over time. Authorities sought to progressively impose Christian norms, which led to a deterioration of conditions for Muslims. The end of Muslim rule in Granada not only closed a historical cycle, it also opened new possibilities for the Castilian monarchs. With the peninsula unified under their authority, they could now pursue other objectives. The military, economic, and political structures that had proven effective during the war were adapted to serve new goals. Granada became a laboratory of territorial integration, with mechanisms later applied in other contexts. The city, after its conquest, underwent urban transformations. Churches were built over mosques, convents were founded, and new forms of neighborhood organization were promoted. The architectural landscape gradually changed, reflecting the new Christian identity of the territory. Ceremonies were held, proclamations issued, and the symbolic presence of royal power was reinforced. The last years of the 15th century were marked by this victory. The name of Granada became part of the royal titles, and the date of its fall was recorded as a milestone. The war had cost enormous sums of money, but it had also generated a feeling of unity. Royal propaganda did not hesitate to present the conquest as an act of justice, legitimacy, and restoration. Columbus and the first foundation of the overseas empire. On April 17, 1492, in Santa Fe, an agreement marked the beginning of an unprecedented enterprise. The monarchs granted Christopher Columbus the position of admiral, viceroy, and governor of the territories to be discovered. In that document, it was also stipulated that he would receive 1/10 of all the wealth obtained and that he would have jurisdiction over legal matters in the new lands. That capitulation clearly established the legal basis of the expedition and defined the authority Columbus would exercise if he found new lands. Before setting sail, preparations were made at the port of Palos. There, 3 ships were prepared, including the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña. The vessels were small, and the voyage represented a gamble with enormous risks. The crew was recruited with difficulty, and some of its members were pardoned convicts in exchange for embarking. The group offered no guarantee of success, but the Catholic monarchs backed the enterprise because they wished to find an alternative route to Asia, different from the one dominated by the Portuguese via Africa. On August 3rd, they set off westward. The first destination was the Canary Islands, where Columbus corrected the course and supplied the ships. From there, on September 6th, the Atlantic crossing began. During the journey, the sailors' morale declined as no land was sighted. Despite the growing tension, the admiral maintained the course with determination, confident he would reach his goal. The calculations he used about the distance between Europe and Asia were incorrect, but matched the estimates known by his sponsors. At dawn on October 12th, a sailor spotted a strip of coast. The place, which Columbus named San Salvador, was inhabited by peoples who did not know writing or the use of iron. Those naked, peaceful, and hospitable men became the first to receive Europeans. The admiral interpreted that he had reached an island in the Asian environment, possibly near Cipango or the continent of the Great Khan, according to Marco Polo's descriptions. However, the geography was different from expected. In the following days, the caravels explored other Caribbean islands, such as Cuba and Hispaniola. In each place, Columbus took possession in the name of the crown and collected samples of gold, plants, and animals. He also recorded observations about the indigenous people, noting their docility and the possibility of evangelizing them. In Hispaniola, the Santa Maria ran aground on Christmas Eve, forcing part of the crew to remain on land. There, a settlement was founded called Navidad. The return took place on 2 ships. The return voyage was marked by storms that separated the vessels. The Niña, with Columbus on board, arrived in Lisbon on March 4, 1493, and shortly after reached the port of Palos. The news spread quickly, and soon a new expedition was prepared. This time, the fleet consisted of more than a dozen ships, with hundreds of men, animals, tools, and supplies. It was no longer just about exploring, but about settling and beginning a process of occupation. During the second voyage, which began in September 1493, new areas were explored and settlements were founded. Columbus, however, faced difficulties in maintaining control over the colonists and managing the territories. Tensions with the men under his command increased, and disputes over the distribution of gold and the treatment of the indigenous people generated conflicts. Although his authority was backed by the capitulations, internal problems weakened his position. In the following years, the monarchs sent inspectors and representatives with authority to review the admiral's administration. Complaints of abuses, disorganization, and arbitrariness led to Columbus being removed from his post in 1500. Although he retained the title of admiral, he was forbidden from continuing to govern. Effective control passed to officials sent from Castile, leading to a more stable colonial administration. Meanwhile, other navigators began to explore the newly discovered coasts. Some of them, like Amerigo Vespucci, produced detailed descriptions that made it possible to understand that those lands were not part of Asia, but belonged to an unknown continent. That initial error, maintained for years by Columbus himself, gradually disappeared with the new data collected on subsequent voyages. Maps were corrected, and the notion of a new world began to take hold. The momentum that enabled these expeditions arose from a specific context. The territorial unity achieved by the Catholic monarchs and prior experience with conflicts involving non-Christian peoples provided an ideological and military foundation that facilitated outward expansion. The administrative apparatus and conquest model used on the peninsula were adapted to the new circumstances. Thus, overseas expansion did not occur in isolation but as part of a prior evolution. From 1493 onwards, the Vatican intervened to mediate between Castile and Portugal. Through the Intercaetera Bull and the Treaty of Tordesillas, boundaries were established between the zones that would correspond to each power. Although the agreements were the result of negotiations between the two crowns, they had papal approval. This delimitation had lasting consequences, as it defined spheres of influence in America and other territories yet to be discovered. The first colonial structures emerged quickly. The Antillean Islands functioned as a base of operations and a testing ground for future campaigns on the mainland. From there, expeditions were organized, local governments established, and the distribution of lands and indigenous people began. The implementation of the encomienda system, in which colonists received groups of natives in exchange for their protection and evangelization, became a key element of the early colonial model. Although Columbus undertook 2 more voyages, his influence waned. On the third, he faced internal rebellions, and on the fourth, already without political authority, he was only allowed to explore. He died in 1506 without knowing that he had reached a new continent. Nevertheless, his enterprise was the starting point for a global transformation that altered the balance between continents, cultures, and economies. What began as a search for trade routes evolved into a network of domination that would extend for centuries. In the early years of the 16th century, the Crown consolidated its presence in the Caribbean and began planning continental expansion. News of inland riches, together with disputes among conquerors, propelled the advance into new territories. Politically, economically, and religiously, the Iberian kingdoms were already determined to project themselves beyond the ocean, with a model combining conquest, colonization, and evangelization under the monarchy's protection. Columbus's figure was interpreted ambiguously. To some, he was a visionary who opened new routes. To others, his chaotic administration and arbitrary decisions generated numerous problems. The fact remains that his first voyage, begun in 1492, was the inaugural act of an era in which Europe gained an active presence on almost all continents. The enterprise, which began with uncertainty, became the core of an unprecedented expansion process. Fallen empires, the advance of Cortés and Pizarro. The ships arrived at the coast while the inhabitants watched, not knowing what would happen. Although they had already seen foreign vessels, these brought horses, weapons, trained dogs, and men determined to advance. Cortés landed in Veracruz and sought support among the enemies of the Mexicas. In Tlaxcala, he encountered combat but achieved a pact that allowed him to continue to the highlands. In Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma received warnings and offerings. People spoke of signs in the sky, temples burning for no reason, and thunder without rain. The priests could not explain anything. The population was divided between war and caution. In Cholula, the Spaniards accused the nobles of treason and launched an attack. Houses and temples were destroyed, fear spread, and the path was cleared. Upon arriving at the capital, they were received with honors. Moctezuma hosted them in the Axayacatl palace under strict surveillance. Soon the tension increased. Cortés ordered the emperor arrested, who continued to act as ruler, though without freedom. From the palace, the Spaniards demanded gold, statuettes, and objects to melt down and send. Meanwhile, Alvarado, in charge, attacked during a ceremony at the Templo Mayor. The dancers were killed, and the people responded with violence. Upon his return, Cortés found the city under siege. Moctezuma was made to speak but was wounded and died days later. The escape happened at night. Many fell into the canals or were captured. Despite the losses, Cortés escaped with part of his troops, reorganized his forces, and gained new allies. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasted weeks. Resistance weakened due to hunger and disease. Canoes attacked, bridges were destroyed and rebuilt daily. Finally, the city fell. Mexico rule disappeared. In the Andes, Pizarro advanced with fewer than 200 men. The Inca Empire was weakened by a war between Atahualpa and Huasca. With the army divided, the Spaniards found favorable ground. In Cajamarca, they set an ambush. Atahualpa arrived unarmed. Upon refusing religious conversion, the shootings began. Thousands died. The emperor was captured. During his confinement, he offered a great ransom. It was delivered but not honored. Atahualpa was executed. While European chronicles spoke of conspiracy, Andean accounts spoke of betrayal. Resistance dispersed across various regions. Cusco was taken after fierce fighting. Part of the elite collaborated, others fled. Temples were looted, royal mummies destroyed, and the main plaza occupied. From there, the conquerors organized new campaigns. Control over two great civilizations was now being discussed. The wealth obtained included gold, textiles, maps, ceramics, and records. Many codices were destroyed, new rules were imposed, customs eliminated, and idols toppled. Some indigenous texts recount the events as an irretrievable loss, ruined temples, destroyed symbols, dragged religious figures. The conquest was neither immediate nor total. Although the major cities were dominated, some regions resisted for years. The previous structure was replaced by new authorities, buildings, and rules. In local chronicles, this process was recorded as a total rupture. Few documents survived, but those that did narrate the impact. Some were written in Nahuatl, others dictated by witnesses. They reflect a world that disappeared. From Carlos to Felipe, the global Hispanic monarchy. Carlos was educated in Flanders, surrounded by courtiers who did not speak his language nor share Castilian customs. At 17, he moved to the peninsula to assume the throne. He was received with distrust by the inhabitants of the kingdom who did not know him and saw him as a foreigner. His arrival was marked by tensions as he appointed people from his circle to key positions, causing unrest among the local sectors. His rise coincided with the death of Ferdinand, which allowed him to inherit the crown of Aragon, and shortly after that of his grandfather Maximilian, opening the doors to the imperial title. The set of territories under his rule included not only the peninsular kingdoms but also the domains in America and vast regions in Central Europe. The Hispanic monarchy came to occupy a unique position, governing extensive areas without direct territorial connection. Carlos, as sovereign, had to face the task of administering this complex set from multiple centers of power. The Castilian and Aragonese Cortés were independent bodies that did not share common institutions or identical laws. This structure made coordinated decision-making difficult and prolonged administrative processes. Upon obtaining the title of emperor, Carlos increased his prestige, but also had to face greater demands. The empire he headed was not a centralized structure, but a sum of territories with different realities. Each area had its own rules, economic interests, and local elites. Instead of imposing a unified system, Carlos accepted this diversity as part of the political model he governed. The concept of composite monarchy described this form of government where the particularities of each region were respected, as long as they recognized the common authority of the king. During his reign, royal administration underwent significant transformations. Specific bodies were created to manage American affairs, and territorial councils were strengthened. The Council of the Indies was established to supervise territories across the Atlantic, while the councils of Castile, Aragon, Italy, and others assumed functions in their respective areas. This organization allowed some coordination without eliminating local differences. Instead of suppressing autonomies, they were managed through differentiated institutional channels. One of Carlos's main challenges was to ensure the loyalty of the diverse kingdoms under his command. To achieve this, he promoted agreements with local elites and respected their privileges. In Castile, he had to confront movements such as the comunidades, which demanded greater participation in royal decisions. After suppressing that rebellion, he reinforced his authority without eliminating traditional structures. In America, the administrative organization progressed with the creation of viceroyalties, audiencias, and governorships, partly replicating the peninsular model. In Europe, the presence of territories under Hispanic rule extended through Italy, the Netherlands, and part of Central Europe. Each region required a different control strategy. and the king frequently traveled to maintain balance between local powers and imperial authority. Carlos lived in various places within his domains without establishing a single court. This itinerancy hindered centralization but allowed him to maintain direct contact with the different centers of his empire. At the end of his reign, Carlos decided to abdicate. He divided his territories between his brother Ferdinand, who received the imperial lands in Europe, and his son Philip, who inherited the peninsula, American, and Italian possessions. This division consolidated a new configuration in which Philip became the main manager of the territories of the Hispanic monarchy. Although the imperial unity disappeared, the political structure of his kingdoms remained intact. Philip II ascended the throne with a model different from that of his father. He established his permanent residence on the peninsula and managed the affairs of the empire from Madrid. He founded a system of government centered on the dispatch of documents, with a network of secretaries, clerks, and advisors who centralized information. Although he continued to respect institutional diversity, he concentrated the decision-making process within his immediate environment. Audiences, viceroyalties, and councils continued to function, but under stricter control from the court. One of the distinctive features of Philip's reign was his commitment to administrative continuity. He did not undertake major structural reforms, but consolidated inherited institutions. He maintained the council system, strengthened the figure of the viceroys, and perfected correspondence as a means of governance. Every day, he personally reviewed reports arriving from all territories, made notes in the margins, and took detailed decisions. This rigorous control allowed the government of distant regions to be maintained for long periods without the need for constant travel. Territorial expansion continued during his reign. In addition to inherited territories, the Philippines and new areas in Africa and Asia were added. The incorporation of these spaces increased the complexity of the empire. Instead of trying to standardize these areas, he maintained the model of institutional adaptation. The new possessions were not integrated into a common legal body, but were administered with their own regulatory systems and local power structures. The monarchy acted as a general framework, allowing each territory to maintain its practices while recognizing the authority of the king. In America, the institutionalization process advanced with the consolidation of viceroyalties and the strengthening of the audiences. New governorships were established, and inspectors were sent to review local management. Information flowed to the peninsula through a network of messengers, reports, and account books. Supervision was continuous, although always limited by distance. Philip relied on the role of loyal officials and on review mechanisms that allowed abuses to be detected without altering the operational autonomy of each area. In Europe, the government relied on alliances with the local nobility and a stable military presence. Italian garrisons were permanent, and the Netherlands had a complex administrative structure with governors, councils, and courts. Although tensions arose at times, the model of respect for particularities remained the basis of royal power. Instead of imposing a single vision, a policy of negotiation with the elites was promoted to maintain the general cohesion of the system. Under Philip, the empire reached its maximum geographic extent. From the American colonies to the islands of Southeast Asia, through African enclaves and European regions, the Hispanic monarchy became a global network of diverse territories. Each maintained its language, institutions, and customs, but all recognized the sovereignty of a single monarch. This unprecedented configuration did not respond to a unified plan, but to the accumulation of inheritances, conquests, and agreements that had shaped a flexible and lasting structure. The administration of this system relied on the principle of loyalty to the king and respect for the laws of each place. Philip avoided abrupt reforms and opted for continuity. The court became the center from which relations among the different parts were regulated. Through a network of clerks, accountants, and chroniclers, the flow of decisions was kept constant. Every order had to be reviewed, recorded, and archived. This meticulous system ensured control without eliminating the particularities of each region. The political model of the global empire resulted from practical decisions. A rigid structure was not imposed. Instead, a network of loyalties, privileges, and agreements was built. The king did not govern all areas directly, but delegated functions to local representatives who answered to him. Authority was transmitted through documents. and power was exercised through institutional mechanisms that prevented fragmentation without eliminating diversity. By the end of the century, the Hispanic monarchy had become an unprecedented territorial organization. The variety of its domains, the permanence of its institutions, and its capacity for adaptation allowed it to function for generations. Neither Charles nor Philip designed a theoretical system, but their practical decisions shaped a structure capable of sustaining a power that spanned multiple continents without losing internal cohesion. Potosí and Zacatecas, the economic engine of the Hispanic Empire. In the mid-16th century, a productive system based on the intensive extraction of minerals in specific areas of the American continent began to consolidate. Among the most notable sites were the high regions of Charcas and Nueva Galicia, where two mining centers of unprecedented scale developed, Potosí and Zacatecas. In both places, geographical conditions presented significant technical obstacles, such as altitude and the lack of immediate water sources, but this did not prevent the development of a production model supported by forced labor, adapted techniques, and hierarchical administration. The exploitation of Potosí was quickly organized after its discovery in 1545. Within a few years, it became the most important mining center in the Viceroyalty of Peru. The main vein, located in Cerro Rico, had a silver structure combined with other minerals which required a more complex technical treatment. To face this challenge, the patio system was implemented, which allowed metals to be extracted using mercury and salt through a slow but effective process. The work system revolved around the mita, a compulsory recruitment regime affecting thousands of indigenous people in rotating shifts. Official records show that between 8,000 and 10,000 workers were mobilized each year, with strong demographic impacts on their communities of origin. Many of them died due to physical effort, altitude, cold, or unsanitary conditions. The mines had no adequate ventilation or structured breaks. In Zacatecas, the production logic was different. Although silver was also exploited in large quantities, no official mita was applied as in the Andean highlands. Instead, recruitment was mixed. Both free laborers and captive workers, including enslaved Africans, were used. The Zacatecan mines were distributed in a scattered manner, and mineral transportation was carried out with mules and carts toward northern Mexico, from where caravans left for Veracruz or Acapulco, depending on the destination. Production figures allow us to gauge the volume reached. In Potosí, during the second half of the 16th century, the amount of silver extracted exceeded 150 tons annually. Viceroyalty statistics confirm that between 1570 and 1600, shipments to the port of Seville quintupled. Zacatecas also experienced sustained growth, although with fluctuations linked to the partial depletion of surface veins. The fiscal system was prepared to capture a considerable part of the metal. The Quinta Real, the 20% tax on all registered production, allowed the crown to collect a significant portion before the mineral entered the commercial circuit. Additionally, in places like Potosí, additional fees were charged for smelting, transit, and licenses. Mint houses were created in America to mark the origin and validate purity. The most important operated in Mexico, Lima, and Potosí. The economic impact was immediate. In Seville, the logistics center of trade with America, metal shipments transformed the flow of goods and prices. Trade fairs were reactivated, exchange houses were consolidated, and financial institutions dedicated to transatlantic credit emerged. The regular arrival of silver favored monetary circulation throughout Europe, but also triggered inflationary processes in various territories. According to 16th century records, prices in Castile began to rise rapidly. Wheat, meat, and daily use products doubled in value within decades. The phenomenon, known to contemporaries as carestia, affected mainly urban sectors without access to land. Although wages increased in some cities, they did not cover the generalized rise. European economists of the time, such as Jean Bodin, tried to explain the phenomenon and attributed inflation to the massive inflow of metals from across the ocean. This relationship was discussed in different treatises but remained a widely shared hypothesis among authorities and chroniclers. Contemporary chronicles agree in noting how the arrival of loaded ships altered local values almost immediately. The transport of the metal required organized logistics. From the mining centers, silver was moved in bars or ingots to embarkation points such as Portobello or Veracruz. In those places, fleets were organized under military supervision. Each year, ships departed escorted by armed galleons destined for the Iberian Peninsula. Naval archives preserve the details of cargo, stops, and destinations of each convoy. The official records of the Council of the Indies document how, between 1560 and 1640, at least 180 fleets arrived with significant shipments. Not all the metal belonged to the crown. Private merchants, lenders, and colonial authorities also sent silver. In many cases, quantities were hidden to avoid taxes. Inspections discovered smuggling in trunks, forged seals, and tax evasion networks among the officials themselves. The expansion of the monetary economy was reflected throughout Europe. Countries such as France, Italy, and the Netherlands began to receive metals indirectly through trade with Castile. Textiles, weapons, paper, oil, and other goods were imported, paid for with American silver. In this way, the flow of wealth extended beyond the direct control of the crown. In America, the consequences were multiple. Cities near the deposits, such as Sucre or Guanajuato, were strengthened. Urban growth responded to the demand for inputs, services, and administration. Trading houses, printing presses, and courts increased. Royal roads were consolidated to ensure the transit of the mineral. Bridges, posts, and warehouses were built with the participation of local authorities. Mines required adapted technology. In Potosí, watermills were introduced to crush the ore before mercury treatment. Waterwheels, channels, and tanks required significant investments. The Crown granted licenses, loans, and exemptions to those who committed to maintaining production. The smelters, called ingenios, were spaces with dozens of workers organized in shifts. In Zacatecas, techniques varied according to the vein. In some areas, fire was used to break hard rocks. In others, primitive explosives were used. Working conditions remained extreme. Heat, dust, and accidents were frequent. Workers lived in improvised settlements without basic services. Church records mention respiratory diseases, premature deaths, and forced migrations. The wealth generated also served to pay the monarchy's debts to European bankers. Families such as the Fuggers or the Welsers participated in financial agreements linked to the supply of silver. Contracts signed in Antwerp or Genoa were used, and guarantees were provided on future shipments. This practice transformed metal into an instrument of international credit. The prices of mercury, necessary for the patio system, were controlled from Almaden in Castile. The export of this input was a state monopoly. Shipments went to Lima or Veracruz, from where they were transported to mining centers. Mercury was also stored in guarded warehouses under the control of officials sent from the peninsula. For decades, the American economy revolved around the rhythm of mining production. Decisions on taxes, licenses, and transport were adjusted according to the output of each region. Colonial authorities monitored extracted volumes, local prices, and reports of smuggling. Legal mechanisms were created to regulate the ownership of veins, leases, and disputes among owners. By the end of the 16th century, the abundance of silver had transformed economic balances on a global scale. The world began to connect through trade routes where American metal circulated rapidly. This circulation changed not only markets, but also the forms of control, credit, and taxation that would mark the economic order of the following centuries. Cross and culture, evangelization, mestizaje, and the Golden Age. The evangelizers arrived in America with the task of converting indigenous communities to Christianity. In the early stages, the clergy insisted on suppressing any manifestation of local beliefs. Christian doctrine had to be accepted unconditionally, and native rituals were replaced by Catholic practices. Baptism was mandatory, and its absence was considered rebellion. Missionaries learned native languages in order to impose the evangelical message, but they also used those languages to censor behaviors. Everything that did not fit the imported faith was labeled idolatry. As conversions progressed, some clergy realized that absolute rejection did not guarantee lasting results. Instead of eliminating all pre-Columbian elements, they opted to adapt them. Local songs were transformed into religious hymns. Some festivals were converted into Christian celebrations. Images of saints were presented with features reminiscent of indigenous deities. These modifications aimed to facilitate the acceptance of the new creed without causing abrupt ruptures. Religious instruction included theater, songs, and visual representations to reinforce teachings. Convents became centers of indoctrination. Public confessions were used to expose those who did not follow the doctrine. Converts were expected to adopt not only the faith but also Hispanic customs. Control was not limited to the spiritual, it also intervened in family organization, food, and clothing. Women had to cover themselves according to the peninsula model, and men had to abandon ornaments considered improper. Missionaries promoted marriages under Christian norms, annulling pre-existing ties. Ecclesiastical documents recorded these unions as symbols of social order. Some clergy saw indigenous sexuality as disorderly, and intervention was justified as moral reform. Ecclesiastical control extended to births, baptisms, and burials. At all these stages, a structure defined by the Church was imposed. What was not recorded in its books was not recognized as valid. Religious instruction began in childhood and was compulsory. Children attended schools where they were taught prayers, catechisms, and commandments, which they had to memorize systematically. Images were used as pedagogical tools to illustrate biblical concepts, and depictions of hell were shown graphically to instill fear and reinforce obedience. Learning was based on constant repetition of prayers, and punishments were accepted as valid correction methods. The ultimate goal was to mold individuals submissive to Christian authority, fully integrated into the moral order imposed by the Church. The local population was not only converted but also classified. Colonial administration and the Church developed systems to identify degrees of mestizage. Combinations of origin were recorded, and each category had social implications. Skin color, ancestry, and language influenced opportunities. Terms such as mestizo, mulatto, castizo, or zambo defined hierarchies within the colonial order. Classifications changed over time, but all served to organize control. Children born of mixed unions were subject to special supervision. Some received more intensive religious instruction. They were considered able to oscillate between two cultures. Therefore, the Church insisted on guaranteeing their Christian formation from an early age. In some cases, they were prevented from holding religious positions. In others, they were used as models of integration. Decisions varied depending on context, but the goal was the same: to eliminate any trace of non-Christian practices. While that spiritual pressure was developing, the artistic world of the peninsula was experiencing its own expansion. In the 16th and 17th centuries, a period later called the Golden Age was consolidated. Literature and visual arts reflected imperial power. Writers produced works that circulated in various territories. Theatre reached diverse audiences, and books were exported on ships along with merchandise. Culture was also an instrument of political presence. Cervantes published works where the ideals of honor and courage were central. His protagonist, although defeated, represented common aspirations in a hierarchical society. Lope de Vega produced texts that connected with popular tastes as well as with official values. El Greco painted stylized bodies that responded to a particular spirituality. Velázquez portrayed courtiers with a gaze that combined detail and symbolism. They all shared an environment where art served to legitimize power. The monarchy actively promoted the creation of cultural institutions, positioning the court as the main artistic nucleus of the empire. Palaces not only fulfilled residential functions, but also operated as exhibition spaces where artists were part of the political and symbolic environment of power. Chroniclers recorded relevant events in detail, whose chronicles became part of the imperial archive as testimony of the established order. Public festivities combined theatre, processions, and visual spectacles, organized to reinforce royal authority before the population. Many of these expressions were replicated in the colonies, adapted to the local context, but maintaining their political and ceremonial weight. The patronage system, backed by the nobility, guaranteed a constant artistic production. In exchange for their sponsorship, artists created works that reflected official values and reinforced the ideological discourse of power. Religious manifestations occupied a prominent place. Images were used in processions, altars, and schools. Painting, beyond its aesthetic value, fulfilled a pedagogical function, and sculptures with biblical scenes served as tools for doctrinal teaching. In this context, sacred art could not be separated from its educational and evangelizing purpose. The culture of the Golden Age was also expressed in everyday habits. Private writing grew alongside official writing. Letters, diaries, and manuscripts circulated among diverse groups. Convents were centers of reading and copying. Religious women copied texts and produced verses. Some letters arrived from America, and others left the peninsula for the viceroyalties. Correspondence made it possible to track ideas, norms, and concerns. Cultural exchanges were also reflected in everyday objects. In homes, local pieces coexisted with European products. Religious images shared space with utensils made by indigenous artisans, and some decorative styles adapted to native materials. In workshops, Christian representations were produced using local techniques, the result of agreements between religious orders, local communities, and the artisans themselves. These adaptations were not spontaneous, but the outcome of complex negotiations, and each piece revealed a layer of cultural mestiçage that often went unrecorded in written texts. Amid this process, tensions arose between the official and the popular. Rules dictated from centers of power were not always strictly followed, and some communities reinterpreted imposed symbols. Figures of saints were associated with ancient powers. Rituals maintained pre-Christian gestures even when performed inside churches, and religious songs incorporated traditional melodies. Even dances approved by the church intertwined with movements inherited from other practices. The Golden Age was not only a time of artistic splendor, but also of systematic censorship. Books went through prior filters before circulation, and authors had to avoid topics that could be considered inappropriate. Many works were corrected according to rules imposed by authorities. On occasions, even after publication, they were prohibited or modified. This supervision did not only apply to literature, it also reached theater, painting, and public celebrations, regulating every cultural manifestation according to its alignment with imperial ideology. Evangelization and art circulated together for more than a century. Both were part of the same program of control. The imposition of the cross was inseparable from the dissemination of images, words, and sounds that structured a new symbolic order. The words of the Catechism and theatrical scenes reinforced each other. Images were part of the message as much as sermons. The result was an extensive network that organized daily life in the name of faith and empire. Wars and defeats, the price of hegemony. For much of the 16th century, Spanish dominion over vast regions of the European continent was sustained by a military apparatus that not only conquered but also tried to maintain control over scattered territories. Spain, under the Habsburgs, took on the burden of sustaining its supremacy in Flanders, northern Italy, and Portugal. That effort translated into constant campaigns, troop movements, sieges, and increasingly heavy taxation on the Crown's territories. The situation in Flanders demanded constant presence. The conflict with the Flemish rebels had lasted for decades. The Spanish monarchy sent soldiers, but also money and ships, in a war that drained resources without achieving a definitive victory. Strongholds were taken and lost. Cities were besieged, plundered, and then recovered or handed over, depending on the course of the struggle. Maintaining that war structure required a transnational logistics network involving Italian ports, Genoese bankers, and German or Neapolitan contingents. The political unit supporting that military effort was fragile, and its costs were increasingly evident. In parallel, control over Italy was maintained, though not without friction. Military presence in Milan, Naples, and Sicily was firm, but it relied on local alliances, forced agreements, and constant diplomacy to prevent uprisings. In the case of Portugal, the annexation after King Sebastian's death and the short reign of Henry allowed Philip II to incorporate the Lusitanian crown in 1580. This extended Spanish hegemony to the Atlantic realm and global trade, but also increased tensions. Portugal had its own structures, colonial network, and enemies. Integrating all this framework within the Hispanic apparatus required enormous financial and political effort, which was not always accepted without resistance. This context of wars extended across multiple fronts reached a critical point when Spain decided to confront England directly. Philip II, convinced that English support for the Flemish rebels had to end, designed an invasion plan that would unite a naval force from Lisbon with troops from Flanders. The objective was clear: occupy southern England and force the fall of Elizabeth's government. The project was baptized as the Enterprise of England and required meticulous coordination between the ships sailing from the Iberian Peninsula and the land units waiting on the Flemish coast. The organization of the Armada was not simple. Many of the ships had been improvised. Some were galleys adapted for the Atlantic, others were commercial transports reinforced with cannons. The fleet included more than 130 vessels, a mix of galleons, urcas, and smaller ships. Command was given to the Duke of Medina Sidonia, a respected noble but without naval experience. Even so, the fleet sailed from Lisbon in the summer of 1588 with thousands of sailors, soldiers, and provisions. The order was to meet with Alexander Farnese's troops in the Low Countries and cross the Channel as a block to begin the landing. From the beginning, setbacks appeared. Storms scattered part of the ships and complicated navigation. Upon reaching the English Channel, the Spanish fleet encountered much more organized English resistance than expected. British commanders Francis Drake, Charles Howard, and John Hawkins avoided frontal combat. They preferred to keep distance and attack intermittently, wearing down the enemy's ships with artillery fire from afar. The English ships were more maneuverable, with better firepower. Spanish formations, in contrast, were slow and ineffective in a war of attrition. For several days, skirmishes continued, and when the Armada attempted to reorganize in Calais, it was attacked by fireships launched during the night, causing panic and breaking the fleet's order. The connection with Farnese's troops was never achieved, and the winds and currents forced the Armada to continue north, skirting Scotland and Ireland in extreme conditions. The lack of supplies, storms, and shipwrecks turned the retreat into a catastrophe. Only part of the ships managed to return to Spanish ports, while thousands of men died along the way from hunger, disease, or accidents at sea. Within the empire, the effects of this defeat accumulated rapidly. Tax pressure on Castile increased with the imposition of new taxes aimed at sustaining the war effort, while the nobility claimed privileges but avoided contributing resources, and the protests of the cities were ignored. The system was sustained by an increasingly bureaucratic administration and a fragile economy, dependent on gold and silver from America. Each new conflict required issuing debt, and although foreign bankers continued financing the crown, they did so in exchange for high interest rates and political concessions. The decline was not immediate, but the breaking point had already occurred. The open fronts in Europe were not closed. Conflicts with England continued for decades, as did wars in the north. Spanish presence in Italy was maintained, although with constant tensions. Portugal, which had been integrated into the imperial apparatus, began to show signs of wear. The unification of the Iberian empires proved to be more costly than beneficial in the long term. Militarily, the lesson was clear. The traditional Spanish war model, based on disciplined infantry, prolonged sieges, and control of fortresses, began to show its limits in the face of a more dynamic and technical naval war, which required innovation that did not always come from the central apparatus. Although decisions were made from Madrid, it was the local rhythms in Flanders, Lisbon, or Naples that determined the success or failure of campaigns, and the distance between the court and the theatres of operations remained a structural problem that no king fully managed to solve. The 17th century inherited that same dynamic. Internal tensions, combined with external pressure, progressively weakened the empire's capacity to sustain its hegemony. What had been a triumphant expansion in previous decades now transformed into a constant struggle to resist. The image of an invincible power began to crumble. Spanish power in Europe did not disappear, but it was no longer unquestionable. Maintaining that hegemony came at an increasingly high price. Dead soldiers, indebted cities, and an overstretched administration. The episode of the Invincible Armada did not mark the end, but it was a clear warning of what was to come. Decline between useless kings and late reforms. When Philip II died, the Spanish Empire still seemed intact, but in reality, it was already showing signs of exhaustion. Under his successors, the Habsburg monarchy began to lose effective control over the territories. Philip III stayed away from direct government and delegated essential functions to his favorites, initiating an administrative system that operated by inertia with little royal intervention. The Duke of Lerma accumulated power through networks of favors and positions, which deteriorated the efficiency of the political apparatus. The resources obtained from America were diverted without clear control, while the crown's debts increased. Philip IV continued with this model. The court became even more dependent on its ministers, especially the Count Duke of Olivares, who promoted centralizing reforms that clashed with traditional structures. The attempt to impose a higher tax burden on all kingdoms triggered resistance, such as the Catalan Rebellion and Portugal's secession. These internal crises coincided with a prolonged series of armed conflicts in Europe that overloaded the monarchy's finances. The burden of these wars was transferred to the American territories, forced to support part of the military effort. In the time of Charles II, the problems worsened. The nobility maintained privileges without assuming real functions in state management. The crown depended on revenues that no longer grew at the necessary pace. The cities were subject to constant fiscal pressure. The bureaucracy had grown, but without efficiency. Despite some attempts to regain control over spending, the structure was burdened by inherited commitments, clientelism, and corruption. The lack of a clear succession generated early disputes over the throne, while the administration lacked cohesion. The population suffered the impact of poor harvests and epidemics without a coordinated response from the center of power. The transition from the Habsburgs to the Bourbons implied a change in the conception of government. Philip V introduced new forms of organization following the French model. Royal authority was concentrated around the monarch and his ministers, displacing old councils and reorganizing competencies. One of the first changes was the elimination of fueros in several peninsular kingdoms after the War of Succession, which allowed progress toward a more uniform administrative structure. From there, secretariats of office were introduced to manage specific areas of government, which facilitated greater control over decisions and resources. During his reign, new institutions were created to supervise the functioning of the state. The intendancies appeared as bodies responsible for coordinating justice, finance, and defense in their respective territories. This figure, adopted from the French model, allowed the central government to directly oversee regions, reducing the power of traditional local authorities. The intendants were subordinated to the crown, which prevented the formation of their own clientelist networks. Their presence gradually extended to the American territories, where they assumed similar functions. With Charles III, the reforms intensified. The fiscal structure was reorganized to improve revenue collection. New ordinances were applied to professionalize the army. The navy received investments to renew its fleet. Domestic trade was promoted by eliminating customs barriers between provinces. The monarchy promoted an economic policy oriented toward agricultural and manufacturing growth. New communication routes were created, and the establishment of commercial companies was supported. In parallel, the network of intendancies in America was consolidated, strengthening the direct presence of central power. The Bourbon reforms also extended to the educational and scientific fields. Institutions were founded to train technicians and officials. The Crown supported scientific expeditions, cadastres, and censuses to better understand the territory. These measures responded to the need to strengthen the state's capacity at a time of competition with other European powers. Missions were sent to study natural resources, create maps, and organize populations. The state apparatus thus acquired a more modern dimension, although it continued to face resistance and structural limitations. The Church, although maintaining its influence, was subject to stricter control. Ecclesiastical privileges in certain areas were reduced, and the clergy's intervention in civil matters was regulated. In America, changes arrived slowly, but the Bourbon administration managed to implement more direct oversight over the encomienda system and viceroyal finances. Customs reform allowed increased revenue, and the reorganization of colonial trade sought to eliminate intermediaries who benefited specific groups. Rules were established to prevent abuses by colonial officials. Charles IV inherited this reformed system, but faced a changing international scenario. The Bourbon administration had strengthened, but it had also generated tensions due to the reduction of local autonomies. Centralization had allowed greater efficiency, although it also increased discontent among sectors that lost influence. Administrative modernization did not solve the structural problems of social inequality and land concentration. Fiscal pressure continued to fall on popular classes, while the nobility retained privileges without contributing proportionally to the maintenance of the state. The reformist drive was interrupted by external conflicts that began to alter the balance achieved. The war with England and political changes in Europe hindered the continuity of modernization plans. Despite advances on several fronts, the reforms did not completely transform the colonial structure nor resolve internal social tensions. The vice-regal structure continued to rely on traditional hierarchies. Cities grew, but without effective urban administration. Geographic distances and slow communications complicated centralized control. In the cultural sphere, control over intellectual production was promoted. Academies, libraries, and universities were used as means to train officials and consolidate state authority. Expressions that questioned the political order were limited. Nevertheless, a moderate critique began to emerge from enlightened sectors proposing gradual improvements. This current did not reach levels of political radicalization, but it laid the foundations for future challenges. The administration was forced to respond with censorship, although maintaining certain spaces for debate. In this context, the Bourbon state apparatus reached a degree of professionalization that had not been seen during the Habsburg period. The figure of the trained bureaucrat, subject to rules and procedures, replaced the system based on favors and personal loyalties. The selection of officials began to be linked to their abilities, at least in theory, and audits and inspection visits were introduced to control abuses. Archives ceased to be mere repositories of documents and became active management and oversight tools. Thus, the administrative logic was transformed from reactive to proactive. However, the internal fragmentation of the empire and the diversity of regional interests continued to be obstacles to applying these reforms uniformly. Despite advances on different fronts, the empire remained vulnerable. The heavy dependence on colonial resources, a fiscal system insufficient to cover state expenses, and a commercial network concentrated in few actors continued to condition its functioning. The reforms attempted to mitigate these distortions, but without altering the economic foundations that sustained them. The monarchy retained its formal legitimacy, although its capacity to adapt was increasingly limited in the face of changes taking place both inside and outside its domains. From rebellion to nation, the end of the Spanish Empire in America. The scenario began to change slowly. By the end of the 18th century, some sectors of the American colonies were already showing signs of discontent. In various cities on the continent, Creole groups began to reject the exclusive control of the peninsulares over high civil and military positions. The distance between those born in America and those coming from Spain became increasingly visible in institutions, commerce, and administration. This tension did not yet mean a rupture, but it did announce that the imperial structure was beginning to show internal cracks. The international context was key. In 1789, the French Revolution broke out, and with it came new political ideas that crossed the Atlantic. The notion of popular sovereignty, citizens' rights, and the rejection of absolute monarchy became part of the debate among enlightened sectors of America. Some read pamphlets in a low voice, others discussed them in private meetings. Although they did not openly proclaim themselves revolutionaries, these enlightened Creoles closely observed the changes in Europe. At the same time, colonial authorities reinforced control over printing presses and communication networks. Enlightenment ideas were not welcome in the circles of vice-regal power. Texts speaking of republics, equality, or liberty were persecuted by the Spanish authorities, who considered all that a direct threat to the established order. Despite efforts to contain them, the ideas continued to spread through books, letters, and travelers. The Napoleonic invasion of 1808 changed everything. When Napoleon forced Ferdinand VII to abdicate and placed his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne, a power vacuum arose in America. It was no longer clear who should govern. In many cities on the continent, open councils began to be organized. These were not new institutions, but they adopted a different role. They proclaimed themselves as legitimate representatives of popular sovereignty in the absence of the monarch. In places such as Caracas, Bogotá, Buenos Aires, and Santiago de Chile, local juntas were formed claiming loyalty to the captive king, although in practice they were beginning a process of autonomy. Some limited themselves to demanding reforms, others began to act as independent governments. Not all territories reacted at the same time or in the same way, but the pattern repeated itself. Power passed into Creole hands while royal authorities lost legitimacy. Political projects were also different. Some proposed constitutional monarchies, others defended republican models. There were those who thought of broad federations and those who wanted to centralize power. These differences not only pitted independence supporters against royalists, but also patriot groups against each other. Internal disputes weakened the revolutionary fronts and facilitated the royalist counterattack in several stages. In the Mexican case, the process had its own characteristics. In 1810, the priest Miguel Hidalgo made a popular call from Dolores, inviting people to rise against the viceregal authorities. His initial movement gathered peasants, indigenous people, and rural sectors, but it was quickly suppressed. Later, José María Morelos attempted to organize a government with its own structure and convened a Congress in 1813. Although he was also defeated, the ideas of independence continued to spread. Meanwhile, in Europe, Napoleon's fall in 1814 allowed Ferdinand VII to return to the throne. His return meant the re-establishment of absolutism and the annulment of the liberal reforms that had been attempted during his absence. This decision deepened rejection in America. It was no longer just a crisis of authority. Now there was direct opposition to the political model that was intended to be reinstated. The Royalist offensive resumed with force. Troops sent from the peninsula, along with loyal militias, managed to regain control of some regions. However, the independence resistance did not disappear. In various parts of the continent, patriotic leaders reorganized their forces and launched new campaigns. The war became prolonged, costly, and changing. In the south, José de San Martín led a strategy that involved crossing the Andes from Argentina to Chile and then advancing to Peru. His operation was complex but succeeded in liberating key territories. In the north, Simón Bolívar combined military campaigns with political agreements that allowed him to consolidate regional alliances. His goal was to build an American unity, although he soon faced local resistance. By the 1820s, most territories had proclaimed their independence. However, international recognition was not immediate. Some European powers still doubted the legitimacy of the new governments. In addition, the process left behind deep instability. The wars had destroyed much of the colonial infrastructure, generated social tensions, and caused clashes among former allies. In many cases, the new states emerged without a clear government structure. Constitutions were drafted and reformed frequently. Military leaders gained power in contexts of institutional vacuum. Some attempted to impose centralism, others defended regional autonomy. Conflicts did not stop after the break with Spain, but shifted to the interior of the newly formed countries. The legacy of the independence process was complex. On one hand, it meant the disappearance of Spanish imperial rule in continental America. On the other, it left divided societies, weakened economies, and unstable political structures. The initial aspiration for unity dissolved in the face of local interests and fragmented leadership. Some territories remained tied to external dynamics. The need for diplomatic recognition led to seeking alliances with new powers. Trade relations were redirected to other markets. In a few years, the link with the metropolis was replaced by new economic and geopolitical dependencies. Independence was not the product of a single moment or a single will. It was the result of multiple factors accumulated over time: a distant central administration, reforms imposed from outside, an unequal social structure, and a series of wars that ultimately broke the colonial ties. For Spain, the 19th century began with the progressive loss of its American possessions. In less than 3 decades, the imperial core that had defined its power for centuries disappeared. Although it attempted to maintain control in some regions, the emancipation processes were irreversible. In Latin America, the creation of new states marked the beginning of a different stage. The ideals of freedom and sovereignty coexisted with the difficulties of consolidating stable systems. The end of Spanish rule did not immediately bring prosperity or order, but it did pave the way for a history of its own, marked by internal tensions, quests for identity, and political transformations that continued throughout the 19th century.